is recording. Okay, and then audience is seeing your screen. So we just want to confirm.
People are trying to get me to come back. You're so funny.
Come back where?
To Ottawa.
Oh.
So make me 100K jobs, like.
Oh, they're like, here we are. Okay. All right, audio works, confirmed. So we're ready to go, and it is recording. Okay. Just make sure the screen they're seeing is the screen. Okay, there's nothing more to do. Done.
Okay. Fabulous. So is this light, the red light, means that stuff is the light doesn't turn green?
No, I think it means that means that it's on. Yeah, because she can hear us now. So,
okay, cool.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oscar, is the volume level okay? Should I see here?
No, it's okay. You can like totally zone out.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
okay.
yeah, you don't have to be
okay.
super present for this. Just gonna turn this on. Okay. Is she gonna be listening to the whole thing?
I think so. Yeah.
Oh
yeah. No! Do you want her to not?
No.
Okay.
It's okay.
Okay.
You don't have to do that.
Do you want me to actually go?
That's a great question. You can go to work, yeah.
Yeah, and then that way it's like, yeah. Okay, perfect.
And first time I was gonna sound like
you've got it. Okay.
I feel like I've got it. If I don't, I'll just figure it out.
Okay, so I'll come back up in like 40 minutes, maybe?
Yeah, come back in 40 minutes.
40 minutes? Okay.
Yeah, that works.
Will do. All right, awesome. Thank you.
Do I click? Can I click myself?
Oh, yeah, let's just. Or them, just give you them notes.
Okay, perfect.
All right, and we just wouldn't want to press, we don't want to press stop recording, so we leave that has to stay. Or maybe if you click up here on sharing, it'll just, yeah, so that won't even be a thing. Okay, perfect.
Okay. Fabulous.
Okay, so I'll see you in 40 minutes.
All right.
Bye.
So good afternoon. Wow. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yami Msosa, and I'm super excited to go through this topic with you today on misogynoir and gender-based violence. While the topic in itself is not one that is joyful in nature, it definitely is something that is not as talked about often within the context of GBV spaces. And so thank you to OCASI for having me today. So it's really important for me to locate myself not only as a survivor of gender-based violence, of sexual violence, but also as someone who has worked with survivors for about 10 years. And recognizing that in this webinar, there's always room for growth and ways to learn, and that in many ways, I learned from participants just as much as you hopefully will learn from me. So just contextualizing that as well. I also want to let you know that there will be 3 sections within this webinar. So we'll be covering what is misogynoir, exploring how it relates to vulnerabilities of violence, and looking at systemic failures, which does include conversations in areas of specifically locating service providers in ways that they can think about implementation around issues that surround misogynoir in terms of service provision, also in terms of internal practices around anti-racism and anti-oppression. And so before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on unceded and unsurrendered Indigenous land, wherever you are. If you are on Turtle Island, and if you are a settler like myself, I'm currently residing within the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. And it's important that, when we talk about gender-based violence, that we centralize the experiences of Indigenous communities. Many times I've been asked, well, why do you do a land acknowledgement at the beginning, and why do you center those pieces? And really, it's to acknowledge that Canada was not founded on, Canada was founded on through a violent process that included rape, genocide, as well as gender-based violence, and how those were integral tools of colonialism and continue to be today. And, we cannot talk about anti-Black racism and gender-based violence. We cannot divorce the conversations from one another if we are truly operate from an intersectional lens in terms of looking at connecting multiple struggles and systemic violence. So for those of you who have done trainings with me in the past or heard me speak, you may have seen me reference this chapter by Lana James called Censure and Silence, which is in African Feminisms. Here she talks about the realities of Black women in Canada being subjected to significant levels of sexual violence without proper support. And so despite the increase in awareness, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done within service provision and delivery. And this webinar in no way is meant to shame or blame, but rather say, okay, we know that there's gaps. How do we move forward? So I put this quote up to center that within our conversation today. The second quote is by Joe Coco, who addresses the realities of misogynoir that is not only in terms of our actions, but our inactions, especially when it comes to the contributions of Black women. And when I use the term women, I'm referring to cisgender trans women, those who are non-binary, femme-centered, folks who also experience misogynoir, in which we'll get to the definition in a moment, but often when I've been in spaces, the centering of misogynoir has been around cisgendered women, and there needs to be a recognition that, yes, cisgender women experience misogynoir, but that folks who identify on multiple gender spectrums also experience misogynoir as well, and being able to contextualize that. And so this quote here is from Misogynoir Mondays, and I really loved it because it really encapsulates when we talk about misogynoir, the various ways that it shows up. And so you'll see it reoccurring throughout the presentation. Next, I want to also contextualize that while I am delivering this presentation today, there has been decades upon decades upon decades of work that has led to this moment. So everything that I'm sharing here today did not come from my own volition. In fact, much of it has been learned through scholarship, i.e. the academic industrial complex, i.e. university, lived experience, as well as the relationships and conversations I've had. And so I do want to acknowledge, that here are some of the names of folks that have influenced our conversations today, whether it be through personal relationship or through reading their work or watching their videos. And so just taking a moment here to reflect on the names. Okay, so next I'd like to highlight the definition of anti-Black racism. Many times I am told that theory is not practical because it is too abstract. And I really want to caution that frame of thinking because theory is what directly influences our everyday practice, right? Around thinking and strategizing around intersectionality. Excuse me. So in that light, if we were to look at anti-Black racism, we know that there are multiple entry points to the definition. So in this definition here, we see that anti-Black racism describes the nexus of intersecting oppressions experienced by Black people in Canada. Because of their skin color, it is also rooted in a legacy of strict slavery and colonial rule, historical practice that construct Black people as questionable subjects or non-humans. It provides a lens to understand how racism works to devalue Black lives, with the effect of Black people are disadvantaged at all levels of social life, i.e., social, economic, and political. Right? And so I'd like to emphasize, and that this quote by Solomon Giwa is so incredibly powerful because as we see, there's multiple entry points in which anti-Black racism can occur. And moreover, that it does happen by other folks of color as well, right? And so in emphasizing, the definition of anti-Black racism and highlighting it, I'd also like to talk a bit about how, when we think about racism, it's important in this diagram here, and there's limitations to this diagram, but what it shows us is that racism is not a singular act, right? It's not an overt act, but there's multiple ways, systemic ways, institutional ways, interpersonal ways that we see overt and racism show up, as well as passive racism. The term passive I don't really like, but the ones in which people don't really question, right? And so, and a core example of this is, the over-familiarization with people of culture, people of color, not challenging racist jokes, or the self-appointed white ally who has read a lot of theory and somewhat is able to theorize, solidarity, but not necessarily able to put it into action. And again, this is not to shame or blame, but it is to take a moment of pause and reflect that if we are going to be talking about misogynoir, if we are going to be talking about anti-Black racism and various other forms of oppression, that we decenter the ways in which it occurs, right? And also recognizing that the way that we think, how we know what we know in terms of epistemology, can also impact, is embedded in anti-Black racism, right? In terms of who we see as valuable versus invaluable through knowledge production. So, moving on. The next thing I'd like to cover is, emphasizing, and many of us are familiar with the term intersectionality that was coined by a legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw. And so understanding that misogynoir does not occur in a vacuum and that our experiences of disability, sexuality, gender, migration influence those realities and those interlocking systems of power and the ways that they're experienced by individuals. And so intersectionality is a framework, again, coming back to what I said earlier about how theory influences practice, is looking at the ways in which, racialized, feminized folks, or Black feminized folks, experience gender violence in very nuanced ways, which also impacts the ways in which they access legal supports or access social services. And so intersectionality gives us a framework to think about those, right? It's not just about the identities, it's about the interactions with systems of power. Okay, so let's define misogynoir. The term was first coined by Moya Bailey in an article within the Crunk Feminist Collective, where she was expressing the connections between misogyny and the experiences of Black women. And so she first published this article in 2010, and so we're in 2019 now, so over 9 years ago. And here is a more wordy definition for all intents and purpose. But I'm going to read it out here. So misogynoir is from the word misogyny, so the hate of women, and noir, Black. And so specifically anti-Black misogyny, where race and gender together are factors of this misogyny and creates a binary where white women representing good womanhood and Black women do not. Or has levels that include other women of color, but insofar as Black women are the most degraded and placed at the bottom. This binary creates an invisibility for Black women's pain. Again, coming back to what I said earlier about femme folks, so folks who may not necessarily identify as women, but experience violence due to femininity. And hypervisibility for what are deemed inherent flaws based on Black womanhood as an ultimate conception of non-womanhood, as posed by a woman. This is why even with cis privilege, cis Black women are masculinized as tools of violence and hypersexualized as a tool of violence, as undesirable objects to be controlled and disposed of, and as hyper desirable objects of sexual use and disposability simultaneously, all at the same time. So, whoa, we are going to unpack this definition. We're going to talk about the ways in which hypersexualization as well as undesirable politics come out in conversations with misogynoir. And so if we come into that, right, if we come in off of that framework in terms of looking at the ways in which Black women are put into these archetypes, right? Coming back to Misogynoir Mondays, there's this quote here. So misogynoir is an attempt to force Black women into boxes to make us more palatable. It is the idea we should never scream, fight, never take ownership over ourselves, because the minute we do, we are painted as the angry Black woman and dismissed, right? So let's take a look more into the archetypes that show up. So first is the Jezebel. Okay, so the Jezebel is a hypersexualized sexual siren characterized as a Black woman who's overly sexualized, aggressive, sexually promiscuous, and uncaring. And in this picture here, we see Sarah Baartman, or a characterization of Sarah Baartman, right? And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the story of Sarah Baartman, I would encourage you to do a quick Google search. And for the purposes of this webinar, I can't go too much into it, but her body was used as a tool for science. And it is really disturbing, but I think what it also shows is this nature of the Black woman's body as this spectacle, right, as this thing to be colonized. And with the stereotype of the Jezebel, we see it manifesting in present day. If we look to hip hop culture, now this is not to shame, I love hip hop and all of those pieces, but it is to say that there's a desirability or an aesthetic that is prescribed with Black women's bodies. So if we think of the big booty, the big chest, the cinched waist, the over-exaggerated features, and how this plays out in everyday life in terms of the accessibility or the permissibility that folks have when talking to survivors of being in an open space and someone labeling them and assuming that they are hypersexualized because of the way that their bodies are, right? Or even family members as well. So it doesn't always have to play into that stranger danger type of mythology. But this idea that it almost goes unquestioned, right? The sexual siren Jezebel. And, I encourage you to do a quick Google search of hypersexualization of Black women. And, the first video that popped up for me was a video of Nicki Minaj, the song Anaconda, and how there were parallels being drawn between the ways in which Black women are hypersexualized and how commodified, must add, commodified, um, and how that is seen as permissible, right? And how it also leads to violence and plays a role in the stereotypes and the mythologies that people have that are unquestioned, right? The next one I want to talk about is the mammy. So, the mammy is the church-going, maternal, nurturing, family-oriented figure who is completely self-sacrificing for her own, family and doesn't really care about her own needs. And this is an image from the Help, right? And if you folks have seen the Help, it's like the perfect characterization of the mammy. And so, the mammy archetype or stereotype, however you want to frame it, is a Black woman who is seen as sexually undesirable. And so if we're coming back to that quote of Misogynoir, where it's talking about how Black women are masculized as a tool of violence and simultaneously hypersexualized, the mammy is the masculinized version. She's undesirable. They're undesirable. And in many ways, due to that, the violence that they experience does get questioned because they are not seen as physically desirable, which we know in itself is problematic. But there's other ways in which this strong Black woman who is self-sacrificing also plays out in being able to support survivors. So many times I've had to decenter with folks and say, hey, can we talk a bit about the strong Black woman narrative of you being a caretaker of everybody else? You're going through something. So what does it look like to take care of you? Oh, I've never had that option. And the reality is, in most cases, yeah, you're absolutely right. They may have never had the option to and have always had to take on that archetype of strength and self-sacrificing and nurturing. And so it's interesting in ways in which we're able to, like I said, decenter and break that down and take what we need from it and leave what no longer serves individuals. But coming back to the mammy archetype, really important to contextualize that because it feeds into a lot of stereotypes around Black women being undesirable. And so, for example, why would anyone sexually assault this individual, or why would anyone harm this individual if they are not seen as valuable? Right? Excuse me. The next is the sapphire. So the sapphire is the angry, hostile, aggressive, nagging, dishonest woman. When working with young survivors, specifically when I was in Ottawa, young mothers, one of the things that often came up was, she's really angry and I find her aggressive and there's no really way to trust this individual. And these are other service providers talking to me about someone who's accessing support, participant, client, however you want to frame it. And, for me, it was always about taking a moment to think and pause and say, do you not realize that you're perpetuating a stereotype of this young human that is seeking support and probably has every right to be angry, right? And why does the anger of a Black woman or a Black feminized person make you feel so uncomfortable, right? Anger is a valid response to marginalization, to feeling disempowered, to not getting what a person needs in that moment. and how that in itself acts as a barrier for people to get support, right? And it's not to say we folks can't be accountable for their action if they're harming others, but the sapphire is one that I've seen, an archetype that I've seen, a stereotype that I've seen, a violent stereotype. I'm like building on language because it is what it is, right? That I've seen impact the lives of folks. And so this is also where, when we talk about survivorship, right, and we talk about accessing supports, whether it be going to the police, that these play a factor in it. If I don't believe in anything, I don't believe in the term of a perfect victim, but I do believe that if someone presents as angry or hostile, right, when reporting something to police, or has a mistrust in the police, or has a mistrust in service providers, they're not gonna, that does impact the ways in which they're seen as credible. That does impact the ways in which people want to support them if they find them difficult, right? I'm working with young Black women now here in Toronto. It's like, yeah, they think I'm an angry Black woman, so why would I go and get support from them? They don't recognize that how much I've been through. And so I know I keep it, re-emphasizing this point, because I think that it has tangible and material impacts. And it's a stereotype that all of them are harmful, but it's a stereotype in present day that I often see hinders in terms of access of supports. Okay, so next we're going to go into vulnerabilities of violence. So being able to locate vulnerabilities of violence, really want to look at the historical as well as the contemporary context of how anti-Black racism or misogynoir is experienced. And so it's important, and if you look into The Coloniality of Gender and Coloniality of Power by Annabelle Quijano, you see that gender-based violence has been a tool of colonialism, right? It's been a tool of imperialism. It's been a tool of displacement. We see it in present day in terms of if folks who are women, or femme folks who are displaced in countries, the likelihood of them experiencing gender-based violence is extremely high. And we know that from historical context, slavery was a tool of gender-based violence, right? And the displacement of bodies, right? And so in being able to contextualize those pieces, it also allows us to see that not that we're coming necessarily full circle, but that there's been a historical continuum of the ways in which Black women, Black femme folks experience gender-based violence systemically, right? And I use the picture on the right not to be hyper-sensationalizing in the sense of look at these Black bodies in cages, but when we look at immigration policies and the trajectories that some governments globally are taking, that it is what it is. People are being displaced and put into prisons. We don't have to look too far to know that that is a reality, and to know that this is an image from Sierra Leone, excuse me, and so in Sierra Leone. Words today, Sierra Leone. We see here an influx of, I think it was like 2/3, I believe it was 2/3 of girls and women who were displaced, right? And how sexual violence and gender-based violence was, the statistics were something around like 70% of them experienced that. So again, coming back to the reality that this is a continuum. And so if we take a look at the statistics here, we know that Black women are less likely to report their assaults. And so these statistics, yes, are reflective of the US, and that is because there's gaps in Canadian statistics. However, these realities present a similar here, right? And being privileged enough to and currently privileged enough to support Black survivors primarily as my work, I know that it is reality that they are less likely to report sexual violence. There is mistrust in the criminal justice system. And that a number, over the weekend I had the privilege of teaching trauma-informed yoga to a group of survivors of sexual violence, and we spent a whole section of time talking about familial violence and talking about, whether it was a family friend or whether it was an uncle or a brother or someone that was close by who had harmed them before the age of 18, and we see that here reflected in the statistic. We also know that trans women of color, specifically Black trans women, are more likely to experience different forms of violence within intimate relationships as well. And Black women are 3 times more likely to experience death as a result of intimate partner violence or domestic violence than white women. Right? And so these statistics are from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And, the recent attacks of Islamophobia in New Zealand bring front and center that we know Islamophobic violence is an experience of gender-based violence. And we know that since Black women face both anti-Black racism and gendered Islamophobia, they're more vulnerable to Islamophobic violence. And so, this is Rivers of Hope, which is a toolkit on Islamophobic violence for Muslim women and girls. And I really encourage you to check out their website. They have some really amazing resources and host workshops within the community. But, in a report in this document, so in the Rivers of Hope toolkit, they talk about a report that was published by Statistics Canada that noted that 224 police-reported crimes against Muslims occurred in 2015. And they also noted that, didn't click the slide, they also noted that Muslim populations had the highest percentage of hate crimes towards females, right? And the disproportionate rate was Black Muslim women. And so, again, contextualizing that violence is experienced by different bodies and the ways in which different bodies, social locations experience that. And so this is a graphic that was done by the Sexual Assault and Healing Association in the US. So not Sasha in Canada or in Hamilton. But I really appreciate, when looking at the vulnerabilities of violence, this diagram, right, that they've created to talk about Black women's experiences, or the triangulation of rape. And so what they do is, in many ways, draw what we've already talked about in this webinar, in which oppression, slavery, institutional forms of violence, so terrible immigration policies and practices have an impact on systemic barriers that perpetuate rape culture, that perpetuate victim blaming, that perpetuate the demoralization and exploitation of women, right? And that looking at the systemic barriers, the ways that cultural appropriation plays a role, the ways that over-sexualization, the stereotyping, when we talked about the archetypes, this really hones it in and brings it together to show the ways in which it's not these actions in isolation, but, as I mentioned earlier, part of a continuum. And so they're going to be coming out with a more extensive document in the next couple of months, and I'm excited to see some of the data and some of the content that is going to come out of that. So now we move into the last part of our conversations in terms of the impacts of misogynoir and gender-based violence, is looking at the systemic failures of mainstream movements. And I want to bring in here my supervisor for my master's program at Glen Martinez who always talk about critical hope and how we can fail better in many ways, and how it is important for us to recognize, to not get stuck in the cycle of guilt, right? But how do we move forward? So, in looking at, excuse me, in looking at, there we go. So, in looking at systemic failures, the first one I want to talk about is the over-reliance of the prison industrial complex when it comes to responses of gender-based violence, including responses to misogynoir. And Angela Davis was the amazing activist, scholar, organizer who coined the term prison industrial complex to talk about the ways in which prisons do not disappear problems, and how prisons were another form of systems of death, but in many ways, putting people in jail for the crimes that they've committed doesn't necessarily solve the issues in itself, right? And feeds into systems of capitalism. Now, it's not to say that people should not be held accountable. That is not what the argument is, but it is to say that, and this quote encapsulated, if we look at homelessness, unemployment, drug addiction, mental illness, illiteracy, are only a few of the problems that disappear from public view when human beings are contended, human beings are contending with them, are regulated to cages. So one of the things that often comes up when folks ask me, okay, so are you saying you don't believe in the criminal justice system, or people going to jail for committing, gender-based violence or committing sexual violence? And I say to them, I do not believe people, I believe people should be held accountable for their actions. But I would like to know, and based on my experiences, how going to prison or going to jail actually changes somebody's behavior. There have been countless times where I've worked with survivors, their partners will go to jail, or family member will go to jail, come back and re-offend in the same ways. And so it creates this moment of pause of what is actually the goal here, right? Is it to rehabilitate? Is it to unlearn behaviors? Are some folks unable to learn behaviors? Absolutely. I don't want to create blanket statements, but it is to say that in many cases, the criminal justice system or the prison industrial complex doesn't actually lower experiences of gender-based violence. And statistically, we know people are not going away for sexually assaulting or committing gender-based violence towards folks. And, there's a number of graphics that talk about how 10% of folks who report of that, a fraction of them will actually see any type of meaningful jail time. And that's due to stereotypes, that's due to broken systems, in which I'll get into a bit more. And so I do believe fundamentally that if we are looking at ending gender-based violence and sexual violence and misogynoir and all forms of oppression, that the prisons aren't the answer. And it's not to say that I have the answer in terms of, I think that we need to really look at restorative models. We need to look at, healing justice frameworks of accountability, because that is what survivors are always looking for, is some form of accountability. And it also, the last point I want to make around the state and the criminal justice system and prisons as it relates to gender-based violence is that the state is a facilitator, the state of Canada, right, is a facilitator of colonial violence. And so there's multiple contradictions that exist if the same state that was built on colonized land that facilitated gender-based violence against Indigenous communities is then also holding people accountable through prisons, or seemingly through jail time, when the state currently is also a perpetuator of gender-based violence. And, that may get lost on some folks, and that's okay. But it's something to think about in terms of the contradictions that exist there. And some of those contradictions come up in, in these two resources in Policing Black Lives and Invisible No More, where Robin Maynard breaks down Canadian experiences of Black women experiencing sexual and gender-based violence and state violence at the hands of the police, right? And so how that contradiction then occurs, because few and far between, like we know that in terms of reports to the OPIRD, that the second highest complaint is sexual violence. And, police officers, there is a level of impunity that exists, when these crimes are committed. And so we also see that with Danielle Holtzclaw in the States, who was a police officer that sexually assaulted, I think, over 200 Black women, but who were marginalized and criminalized, and thus deemed disposable. And so, what happens when the state, the one that is meant to hold folks accountable for experiencing harm, is also the facilitator of violence? And the complexity also of the fact that many Black women have said to me, and including myself, have hesitated because we see the ways in which people in our lives have been treated by police officers. And so, whereas in many normative spaces, the idea is, well, if something bad happens, you call the police. No, not in my community, because the police are not someone that is safe. The police are not someone that are a group of people that I see as safe. Rather, I see them as causing harm to my communities with impunity. And so that does act as a barrier to being able to access support. And I appreciate Robin Maynard's analysis because she does give tangible examples and names, survivors of state violence in the context of gender-based violence and misogynoir. So would definitely encourage you to take a look into these two resources if you haven't already. They're definitely a worthwhile read. The next, in terms of systemic failures, is the children's aid societies. And so we see here in this article that was published in the CBC, there was a report that showed that too many Black and Indigenous kids in Ontario are in child welfare systems. And the proportionate of Black children admitted to care was 2.2 times higher than the rate of other children. And so, some people may be thinking, okay, well, it's Children's Aid Society, they're there to protect children. When working in different locations and within different organizations, there's almost a guarantee that, in my experience, contextualizing my experience, that if you were in care, you were more susceptible or more likely to experience some form of sexual violence. There was two groups that I remember running vividly, and of the 12 participants, 10 of them had been in care and 10 of them had experienced sexual violence at the hands of a foster parent while they were in group homes. And so, knowing this reality, and knowing the disproportionate rate of Black children and that are in care, and also recognizing that gender-based violence is also one of the reasons why children get taken away. Interweaving all of those systems allows us to make a deduction that there's something broken, right? There's something broken here when we know that instead of supporting mothers, and there's some programs out there that are very that are phenomenal, such as the Young Women at Risk program, that do use a harm reduction model when it comes to supporting young mothers who are fleeing from violence. But the ways in which the disproportionate rate of, if you are experiencing violence, how that translates to women getting their children taken away, as opposed to properly supporting them. And so, from personal experience, from professional experience, it is, like I said, something to consider in an area that doesn't have a lot of data on it. And so being able to think more critically about that. And the next one is one that probably folks will not be a fan of me for, but that is A-okay, which is when we look about vulnerabilities to violence when it comes to anti-Black racism and misogynoir. It is the complicity of BAW organizations as well as GBV organizations in replicating the very systems that they're trying to challenge. And so in Disloyal Feminisms, which is in the anthology of Incite Women of Color Against Violence, Ime Koyama talks about the ways in which domestic violence shelters and systems replicate prisons, in terms of curfew times, in terms of policing women's whereabouts, in terms of the rules and regulations of space. It's not to shit on the shelter system, but it is to take that moment of pause and say, why are we replicating these systems, and how do we operate from a model in which we recognize the complexities of violence and the ways in which they show up for different people. What I appreciate about her analysis within this article, as a frontline worker, when the first time I read it, it mirrored to me and made me think about policies and procedures, and allowed me to then go back to my organization that I was working with at the time and say, how do we mitigate some of this harm, and how do we move away from mainstream white models of support, recognizing that if we really want to truly operate from an intersectional way, that may mean we don't call the police on women. That may mean we have to think of other strategies to be able to support folks. And so, again, the second piece I want to talk about is the lack of understanding of microaggressions in the workplace. So it's not only the outward-facing pieces of being able to support survivors and replicating systems of whiteness and mainstream social work, but it is also, the recognition that if the workplace is toxic, that is going to seep through to service users or clients, right? So, it's like, how do you think about being more inclusive for all intents and purposes, although I have taken lots of issues with that word, because inclusive for whom? Is it inclusive to whiteness? But that is for another webinar. When thinking about a lack of understanding of microaggressions and systemic violence within the workplace, how do you foster a safe space or a safer or braver space, or however you want to phrase it, for clients when workers of color are being treated poorly within the space? And so the piece that I really want to emphasize is, many of you have probably seen this infographic of, when folks of color coming to an organization because they want to reach a specific type of clientele, but that there's not processes, procedures, or even culture that exists that can sustain that. And so, to be quite frank, if as a service provider, if you're thinking about how to make your space more accessible or more being able to support Black survivors, Black femme folks, Black women, you really have to look at the culture of your organization and the ways in which structurally it operates, the ways in which Is your staff reflective? And it's not about just having diversity hires. It's really about recognizing, the ways in which anti-Black racism may occur, silencing may occur, because then it's just gonna fall into a repetitive practice of microaggressions, of repetitive injury in which folks end up leaving, right? And so sustainable models of being able to have culture shift require the work that is more than trainings, but really looking at the hard work of looking internally in the ways in which harm is caused. Through policies, procedures, practices, but also through interpersonal connections and day-to-day interactions. Okay. So, providing a summary of what we just discussed, and being able to locate that we talked about misogynoir, we talked about the ways in which misogynoir is experienced by Black femme folks, by Black women, the ways in which misogynoir is located in non-womanhood, and how Black women are masculinized, words, as a tool of violence and hypersexualized as a tool of violence. We talked about the archetypes of the Jezebel. We talked about the archetypes of the Mammy and the Sapphire and how they influence people's perceptions and stereotypes around Black women and the way that Black women's actions, right, exist within the world. We talked about vulnerabilities to violence. We talked about colonialism, slavery, forced migration, all as parts of continuums of gender-based violence, and specifically misogynoir, the hatred of Black women. We talked about the statistics and the disproportionate rate of the ways in which Black women and Black survivors experience gender-based violence. We addressed the systemic failures of being able to say, hey, we recognize that there is a criminal justice system, that it's well documented that is not functioning to support survivors adequately. And there's been many reforms depending on which government has been in power. But in recognizing that part of the systemic failures is anti-Black racism, police brutality, and the ways in which the state is a facilitator of violence. We also addressed internally within organizations how staff perpetuate the same systems that they're trying to challenge in terms of mainstream colonial structures of policing women's bodies, of surveillance, and how that does happen. And again, encouraging folks to read Disloyal Feminism by Amy Koyama in the anthology of The Color of Violence. And lastly, we talked about workplace culture and structures and how that does misogynoir and gender-based violence. Not so much gender-based violence, I mean, it could happen, but the ways in which workplaces structurally, institutionally, through policies, procedures, through practice, also have to do a decentering. One of the colleagues here at OCASI was talking about white-mindedness, and which is a term that she had first heard from Rania, and thinking about, the ways in which white-mindedness plays a role in how we are professionals and practice social work, and looking at various ways to decenter that. And so the last point is just, again, bringing back that, maintaining critical hope. And that's not being naive to the realities that the systems are broken, and arguably, I believe the systems were never built for us to begin with. But that the ways in which we can maintain critical hope in knowing, okay, we have this knowledge, what do we do from here? And how do we act as folks who maybe are non-Black, right? What are you gonna do, right? It's not enough just to listen to this webinar. There needs to be action and in practice. And so that brings us to the end of our webinar. And so here is my contact information if you ever want to get a hold of me, if you have questions, if you need clarifications around something I said in the webinar, I am always open to that. And so with that, I will say thank you so much for spending the last hour with me. It's been an honor and privilege, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.